When my daughter-in-law told me to clean out the spare room, I smiled instead of crying. I still remember how my face felt in that moment, how the corners of my mouth lifted even though my chest felt heavy, like something had been placed there without my permission. I was holding a folded blanket, one I had washed and dried that same morning, warm once, now already losing its heat. I nodded slowly, the way you do when you want the other person to stop talking, when you want the moment to pass without making a sound. Inside me, something cracked, but it did not make noise. It broke quietly, like a hairline fracture in glass that you don't see until the light hits it just right. I had lived in that house for 12 years. 12 long years that slowly blended together until they felt like one continuous season. 12 years of waking up early because the children had school, even after they grew old enough to wake themselves. 12 years of cooking meals that were somehow always wrong. Too much salt, not enough spice, cooked too early, served too late. 12 years of folding laundry that did not belong to me, matching socks I never wore, pressing shirts I would never put on. 12 years of telling myself, again and again, that this was still my home, that I still had a place here, that love sometimes just looks quieter when people get busy. That day she spoke softly, which somehow made it hurt more. Her voice was calm, polite, almost gentle, the kind of voice people use when they believe they are being reasonable. She said they needed space. She said the room was needed for something else now. She said it was time. She didn't say where I should go. She didn't ask how I felt. She said it the way someone says a line they have practiced many times before, smoothing the words so they would not sound sharp. I could almost see her standing in front of the mirror the night before, repeating the sentences until they felt safe enough to say out loud. As she spoke, I found myself thinking of my husband. It surprised me how quickly my mind went to him, as if he had been waiting just behind my thoughts, ready to step forward the moment I felt weak. I thought of the way he used to look at me when he wanted to say something important but didn't know how to begin. He was never a loud man. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue much. When words became heavy in his mouth, he chose paper instead. He wrote letters to me, even when we lived in the same house, even when we sat in the same room. He said writing slowed his thoughts down and helped him tell the truth. His handwriting leaned a little to the left, always. I used to tease him about it, tell him it looked like his words were in a hurry to come back home. He would smile at that, the small, shy smile that never changed no matter how old he got. His letters were not fancy. There were no big words, no poetry, just honest sentences, written carefully as if he wanted to make sure each one stayed exactly where he placed it. Sometimes he wrote about small things, like the way I hummed while cooking or how the house felt empty when I went out shopping. Sometimes he wrote about fear, about getting older, about not wanting to leave things unsaid. After he passed, those letters became my breathing space. They were the place I went when the world felt too loud, when grief pressed down on me so hard I thought I might disappear underneath it. I kept them in a small wooden box, smooth at the edges from years of being opened and closed. I read them slowly, one at a time, never rushing, letting his voice fill the room the way it used to. Those letters were all I had left of him, or at least that's what I believed then. Standing there with the blanket in my hands, listening to my daughter-in-law explain my leaving as if it were a simple household change, I did not yet know that his letters were missing. I did not know that someone else's hands had touched them, unfolded them, read words that were never meant for their eyes. I did not know that pieces of my past had already been taken away quietly, one by one, without a single question asked of me. In that moment, I still believed my memories were safe. I folded the blanket again, even though it was already neat. It was something to do with my hands, something to keep them steady. My fingers felt cold, even though the room was warm. I remember thinking how strange it was that a house could feel so unfamiliar while looking exactly the same. The walls were the same color. The furniture hadn't moved. The sounds were normal. And yet, I felt like I was standing in someone else's life, borrowing space that no longer belonged to me. I wanted to ask her why. Not the polite why, but the real one. Why now? Why like this? Why after all these years? But the words stayed inside me, heavy and unmoving. I had learned over time that questions often made things worse. Questions led to answers you were not ready to hear. Silence, I had learned, kept the peace, even when it cost you something inside. As she turned to leave the room, she paused for a moment, as if she expected me to say something else. Maybe she wanted reassurance. Maybe she wanted me to make it easy for her. I gave her a small nod instead. She smiled back, relieved, and walked away. Her footsteps faded down the hallway, and with them went the last small illusion I had been holding onto. I sat down on the edge of the bed after she left, still holding the blanket. The room looked different already, like it knew it was no longer mine. I ran my hand over the bedspread, over the dresser, over the small lamp on the nightstand. Each touch felt like a quiet goodbye. I told myself I would pack later. I told myself I needed a moment. The truth was, I was afraid to move, afraid that once I started, it would become real. That was when I felt it, a small tremble in my hands that I could not control. It started in my fingers and traveled up my arms, settling somewhere deep in my chest. I pressed my palms together, hoping it would stop, hoping no one would see. My hands had always been steady. They had cooked meals, held children, wiped tears, cared for a sick husband without shaking. But now they would not listen to me. They trembled as if they knew something my mind had not yet caught up to. I closed my eyes, and without meaning to, I saw my husband again. Not sick, not tired, but the way he used to be when we were younger, standing at the kitchen table with a pen in his hand, thinking about how to begin a letter. I could almost hear the scratch of the pen against paper. I could almost smell the ink. The memory wrapped around me like a soft blanket, the kind of warmth you don't notice until it's gone. At that moment, I did not know that his letters were no longer all where I had left them. I did not know that some of them were already gone, removed quietly, hidden away, or thrown out. I could not yet say. I did not know that someone in that house had decided those words were no longer mine to keep. I still believed that love, once written, stayed where it belonged. I stood up slowly and placed the blanket on the bed. My reflection in the mirror startled me. I looked older than I felt, or maybe I felt older than I had ever allowed myself to admit. My eyes held something new, something fragile and sharp at the same time. I straightened my shoulders, the way I used to when my husband would remind me not to make myself small. I whispered his name without thinking, just once, like a habit my heart had not forgotten. The room stayed quiet, but the sound of it steadied me a little. I did not yet know how much that one name, those unseen letters, and one hidden truth would change everything. I only knew that something important had shifted, that a door had closed softly behind me, and that the life I thought I understood was already beginning to reveal its cracks. I did not know yet that the letters were missing. I did not know yet that someone had been reading words meant only for me. And I did not know yet that my husband, quiet and thoughtful as he always was, had hidden one letter in a place no one else could ever reach, a letter that would speak when I needed it most, long after his voice was gone. But in that moment, I wasn't always a burden. I remind myself of that sometimes, quietly, the way you repeat something true when the world keeps showing you reasons to doubt it. There was a time when I was needed without question, when my presence was expected, even waited for. Once, I was the center of my home, not because I demanded attention, but because love has a way of naturally gathering around the people who hold it together. My husband, Thomas, and I raised our son in a small house that never quite stopped making noise. The floors creaked no matter how gently you walked, and at night you could hear the walls settling, as if the house itself was breathing. It wasn't a perfect house. The paint peeled in places, the windows stuck in the summer, but it was alive. It echoed with laughter, with arguments that ended in apologies, with music playing low while dinner cooked. It was the kind of home where nothing matched, but everything belonged. We didn't have much money, not really. There were months when we counted coins before grocery shopping and years when vacations were just a story other people told. But we had routines, and those routines felt like riches. Sunday dinners were sacred. No matter how tired we were, no matter what the week had taken from us, Sunday evening meant a full table and a slow meal. Thomas would sit at the head, our son across from him, and I would move back and forth between the stove and the table, pretending not to notice how full my heart felt. Evening walks came next, hand in hand, sometimes talking, sometimes just listening to the sound of our steps on the pavement. And there were always notes left on the kitchen table, small scraps of paper with reminders, jokes, or simple words like "back soon" or "don't forget to smile." Thomas was never a man of long speeches. He didn't fill rooms with his voice, didn't feel the need to explain himself over and over. When he felt something deeply, when emotions crowded his chest and refused to settle, he reached for a pen. Writing gave him space. Writing gave him honesty. His letters were never long, never dramatic, just short thoughts written carefully, as if he knew they might be read more than once. He always ended them the same way, with two simple words that became a promise over time. Still yours. I never told him how much those words meant to me. I think he knew anyway. As our son grew older and life moved forward, the letters didn't stop. If anything, they became more thoughtful. When Thomas got sick, they became more frequent. Illness changes time. It stretches moments and makes silence louder. Some days he handed the letters to me directly, watching my face as I read, as if reading my reaction mattered more than the words themselves. Other days he hid them, inside books I loved, tucked into drawers I rarely opened, slipped into coat pockets I wouldn't reach into until winter returned. When I asked him why he did that, he smiled softly and said that one day I would need reminders, that sometimes love has to wait quietly until the heart is ready to hear it. When he passed, the house felt too big and too small at the same time. Every room held his absence, but also his memory. Our son came over often then. He tried to be strong, tried to help, but I could see his own grief sitting heavy on his shoulders. One evening after dinner, he asked me to move in with him and his wife. He said it would be easier for everyone. He said I shouldn't be alone. He said family takes care of each other. I looked around my empty house and felt tired. I said yes. At first, it was warm. Truly warm, not just polite. The house smelled like fresh coffee in the mornings and soap in the evenings. My daughter-in-law smiled easily then. She asked me questions about my life, about Thomas, about the way we used to do things. She wanted to know my favorite tea, my favorite meal, the stories behind old photographs. She called me Mom, and each time she said it, something inside me softened. I thought maybe this new chapter would be gentler than I feared. I tried to be helpful without being in the way. I cooked when asked. I watched the children when needed. I cleaned up quietly, the way you do when you are a guest but hope to become more. I learned their routines and adjusted my own around them. I told myself this was what moving forward looked like, that love sometimes meant blending into the background so others could shine. I brought Thomas's letters with me, of course. I placed them in their small wooden box and tucked it into a drawer in the spare room. That box became my anchor. Whenever the house felt too loud or too quiet, whenever grief rose without warning, I opened it. I read one letter slowly, sometimes aloud, sometimes just in my head. His words steadied me. They reminded me of the woman I had been before loss taught me to shrink myself, before silence became easier than speaking. Time passed as it always does. Days turned into months, months into years. The house filled with routines that no longer included me at the center. I didn't mind, not at first. This was their home, after all. I told myself my role was different now. Smaller, maybe, but still meaningful. I told myself love didn't need to be loud to be real. I didn't notice when the box was moved. It happened quietly, the way important things often do. One day it was where I expected it to be, the next day it was. I assumed I had shifted it myself and forgotten. Grief does that, I told myself. It blurs edges. I didn't count the letters then. I didn't feel the need to. I trusted the house. I trusted the people in it. Trust felt natural, like breathing, like something you didn't question until it became hard to do. Looking back now, I can see how gently everything changed, how slowly warmth cooled into something more careful, more distant. But at the time, I believed we were still just a family, imperfect but connected. I believed love, once given, stayed where it was placed. And I believed the letters, my husband's quiet voice on paper, were safe, waiting patiently for me whenever I needed to remember who I was. The change didn't come loudly. It didn't announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors or harsh words spoken out of anger. If it had, I might have known how to respond. I might have defended myself or cried or at least understood what was happening. But it didn't come that way. It came quietly, slipping into the house like a draft you don't notice until you're already cold. It came in sighs that lingered a little too long, in doors that closed softly but stayed closed, in glances that met my eyes for a moment and then slid away, unfinished. At first, I thought I was just growing sensitive. Grief does that to you. It sharpens your awareness, makes every small change feel larger than it is. I told myself not to read too much into things. I told myself people were busy, that life moves forward whether you're ready or not. But even as I told myself these things, my heart felt uneasy, like it was trying to warn me in a language I wasn't ready to hear. My daughter-in-law began rearranging things. She did it with purpose, with lists and plans and explanations that sounded reasonable when spoken out loud. First, it was the living room. Furniture shifted a few inches here, a lamp moved there. Pictures were taken down and replaced with new ones. Family photos changed positions, some disappearing into drawers. I noticed that the older photos, the ones with Thomas in them, seemed to vanish first. I didn't say anything. I told myself it was her house now. People decorate their homes. That's normal. Then she moved on to the kitchen. Cabinets were reorganized. Dishes I used every day were suddenly placed on higher shelves. Spices I reached for without thinking were relocated to corners I didn't check. She said she was making space, streamlining things, creating order. She said it was better for the children, easier for everyone. I smiled and nodded, even when I had to ask where something was, even when I felt clumsy in a room I had once ruled with quiet confidence. Eventually, she came to my space, not all at once but little by little. A drawer cleaned out, a shelf adjusted, a box moved from one place to another. Each time there was an explanation ready. She said she was organizing. She said it was temporary. She said she just wanted things to look nicer. I listened and agreed, even as a small knot formed in my chest. My room began to feel less like a refuge and more like borrowed space, subject to change without notice. Somewhere along the way, I started feeling like a guest in my own life. It was a strange feeling, one I didn't have words for at first. I woke up each morning unsure of where I fit into the day. Meals were eaten alone more often than not. Sometimes I was told dinner was already finished. Other times, everyone ate earlier, schedules not quite lining up. I sat at the table by myself, listening to the faint sounds of life continuing in other rooms. When I spoke, my stories were cut short. Not rudely, not deliberately, but quickly. Someone would interrupt with a phone call, a child would need something, a conversation would shift direction before I could finish a thought. I learned to trail off, to stop speaking mid-sentence, to swallow words that suddenly felt unnecessary. My presence felt tolerated, accepted in theory but inconvenient in practice. I told myself this was part of aging, part of stepping aside and letting the next generation take over. I told myself it was normal to feel invisible sometimes. One evening, after a particularly long day of quiet, I went to read one of Thomas's letters. It had become a habit, a comfort I allowed myself when the house felt too empty even while full of people. I pulled the wooden box from the drawer and set it on the bed. The moment I lifted the lid, something felt wrong. Not wrong in a dramatic way, but in a subtle, unsettling way that made my stomach tighten. The box felt lighter. I told myself it was my imagination. I told myself paper weighs almost nothing, that grief plays tricks on your senses. Still, I began to count. I counted slowly, carefully, my fingers trembling just slightly. I counted them once. Then again. Then a third time, hopping, I had made a mistake. Each time the number stayed the same. 5 letters were gone. I sat there for a long time, the box open in my lap, staring at the empty space where those letters should have been. My mind raced, searching for explanations. Had I moved them? Had I taken them out and forgotten? Had I misplaced them somewhere else? But even as I asked myself these questions, I knew the answer. I knew every letter by heart. I knew the order they were written in. I knew which ones I read when I felt strong and which ones I saved for days when I felt weak. I knew which letter talked about the rain, about how Thomas loved the sound of it against the roof because it meant we were safe inside together. I knew which one joked about my cooking, about the soup I burned but insisted was fine. I knew which one said he wasn't afraid of dying because I was with him, because love made even fear feel smaller. Those letters were not just paper. They were pieces of my life, carefully folded and preserved. I would have remembered moving them. I would have remembered letting them go. I asked my son gently. I chose my words with care, the way you do when you don't want to sound accusing. I told him some letters were missing. I asked if he had seen them, if maybe they had been moved while cleaning. He shrugged, distracted, his attention already half somewhere else. He said maybe I had misplaced them. He said things get lost sometimes. His tone was light, almost dismissive, as if the matter were too small to deserve more thought. His response hurt more than I expected. Not because he didn't know where the letters were, but because the day she asked me to leave, I went back to my room and sat on the bed, just as I had done so many times before, but this time the feeling was different. It wasn't just sadness or shock. It was a deep, heavy tiredness that settled into my bones, the kind you feel when you realize something has ended, and there is no way to pretend otherwise. I sat there with my hands resting in my lap, staring at the wall, and for the first time I truly felt my age. Not the number of years I had lived, but the weight of all the moments that had led me here. I felt older than I ever had before, older than I felt when Thomas died, because this kind of loss was quieter and somehow lonelier. The room felt smaller as I began to pack. Every drawer I opened seemed to sigh back at me. I moved slowly, not because my body couldn't go faster, but because my heart needed time to catch up with what my hands were doing. I folded clothes I had worn for years, clothes that smelled faintly of the soap I liked, clothes that had been part of my everyday life without ever asking for attention. Each item felt like proof that I had existed here, even if that existence was now being gently erased. As I packed, my eyes fell on Thomas's old coat hanging at the back of the closet. I hadn't worn it in years, not really. Sometimes I touched it, sometimes I held it close on cold nights, but I could never give it away. It still carried his shape, his quiet presence. I took it down carefully and laid it across the bed. The fabric felt familiar under my fingers, worn soft with time. Without thinking too much about it, I reached into the inside lining, a place I had checked countless times before, usually just to feel closer to him. This time, my fingers touched paper. I froze. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me again. I pulled my hand back, then reached in once more, slower this time, more careful. The paper was real. Thin, folded, tucked so neatly into the lining that it felt like it had been waiting for me. My heart began to beat harder, louder, filling my ears. I took the coat into my hands and sat down on the floor, my back against the bed, as if I needed the ground beneath me to steady myself. It was a single letter, folded carefully, just the way Thomas always did. I recognized the paper immediately. I recognized the crease, the slight curve at one corner. When I unfolded it, my breath caught. The date at the top told me it had been written weeks before he died, during a time when his body was growing weaker but his mind was still clear, still sharp enough to see what others could not. I sat there on the floor and read it slowly. I didn't rush a single word. I let each sentence settle into me, the way you let rain soak into dry earth. His handwriting leaned to the left, just like always, steady and familiar, and suddenly it felt as if he were sitting beside me, speaking in that quiet voice I knew so well. He wrote that he worried about me, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the gentle way that meant he had thought about it for a long time. He wrote that he believed I would be treated kindly, but not lovingly, and that there was a difference people didn't always understand. He wrote that kindness could exist without care, without respect, without true concern for the heart of another person. He wrote that people might smile while slowly taking pieces of me away, not because they were cruel, but because they didn't see those pieces as important. He wrote that memories could be stolen, hidden, or thrown aside, but that truth could not. He said truth has a way of waiting patiently, even when buried, even when ignored. He said that one day, when I felt most unsure of myself, I would need to remember who I was before the world tried to make me smaller. Then I reached the last lines, and my vision blurred with tears. He wrote, "If they hide my words, remember this, you were never small. You were never a burden, and you are still mine." I pressed the letter against my chest as the tears came. I cried then, sitting alone on the floor of a room I was about to leave, but these tears were not the same as the ones I had cried before. They were not full of pain or fear or loss. They came from somewhere deeper, somewhere stronger. They came from being seen, from being understood in a way that crossed time and even death. Thomas had known. Somehow, he had known exactly what I would face, and he had left this piece of himself for me when I needed it most. For the first time in a long while, my hands stopped shaking. Later that day, after my bags were packed and the letter was safely tucked into my purse, my daughter-in-law came to speak with me again. Her tone was careful, measured, as if she were stepping around something fragile. I don't remember exactly how the conversation began, only that at some point the truth surfaced. She admitted it, not angrily, not proudly, but almost defensively, as if she needed to justify herself even as she spoke. She said the letters had made her uncomfortable. She said they felt too private to be kept around. She said reading them felt like intruding on something that didn't belong to her, and yet she had done it anyway. She said she didn't think I needed them anymore, that holding on to them kept me stuck in the past. She spoke as if she were explaining something sensible, something reasonable, something she believed I should understand. I listened without interrupting. I listened without raising my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse her. There was a time in my life when I might have tried to defend myself, to explain why those letters mattered, why they were mine. But standing there, holding Thomas's final words close to my heart, I realized I didn't need to convince her of anything. I looked at her and felt a strange calm settle over me. I left that house with 2 suitcases and 1 letter. That was all anyone could see from the outside. 2 worn suitcases, their wheels catching slightly on the edge of the doorway, and an older woman standing a little straighter than she had in months. But what no one could see was the weight of what I carried inside me, the things that could not be packed or measured or taken away. I carried far more than clothes and paper. I carried my husband's love, steady and unbroken, the kind that does not fade just because time moves forward. I carried my own dignity, something I had almost forgotten I still had. And I carried a truth so deep and quiet that no one else could touch it, no matter how hard they tried. The house was quiet as I walked toward the door. Not the comfortable quiet of early mornings or peaceful evenings, but a careful silence, like everyone was holding their breath. The walls felt distant, no longer familiar. I paused for a moment in the hallway, my eyes tracing the shape of a life I had lived there, remembering the small details that never make it into photographs. The way the light fell across the floor in the afternoon, the sound of footsteps overhead, the smell of meals cooking that were no longer meant for me. I did not feel anger then. I felt finished. My son stood by the door, his hands folded together in front of him, his shoulders tense. He looked older than I remembered, not because time had passed, but because regret has a way of changing the face. When he hugged me, it was tight and sudden, as if he were afraid I might disappear if he let go too soon. He said he was sorry. He didn't explain what he was sorry for, and I didn't ask him to. Sometimes apologies don't need details. Sometimes they only need honesty. I believed him. I truly did. But belief did not mean staying. Love does not always mean remaining where you are hurt. I stepped outside, the air cool against my face, and felt something inside me loosen. The sky looked wider than it had in a long time. For the first time in years, the future did not feel like something I had to squeeze myself into. It felt open, uncertain, but mine. As the door closed behind me, I did not feel the sharp pain I expected. Instead, there was a quiet relief, like setting down a heavy bag you didn't realize you'd been carrying for too long. Some losses teach you where home really is. That was something Thomas used to say in his own way, though not in so many words. At the time, I never fully understood it. I thought home was walls and routines, shared meals and familiar rooms. I thought it was a role I played, a place I fit into. But standing there with my suitcases beside me, I realized how wrong I had been. Home was not a room that could be reassigned. It was not a role that could be reduced or taken away. Home was the quiet knowing of who I had been loved as, deeply and without condition. In the days that followed, I moved slowly into a smaller space, one that belonged only to me. There was no rush. No one rearranged my things without asking. No one decided what I needed or didn't need. I unpacked my clothes, hung them carefully, placed my shoes by the door. And then, when the room was quiet and the evening stretched long, I took out the letter. I still read that letter when nights feel endless, when sleep refuses to come and memories rise uninvited. I read it not because I am stuck in the past, but because it reminds me of who I am in the present. I hear Thomas's voice in the spaces between the words, in the pauses he always took when something mattered. His love meets me there, steady and sure, reminding me that I was never invisible, never insignificant, never something to be managed or moved aside. They hid his letters. They touched what was not theirs. They believed that by removing pieces of my past, they could shape my present. But they forgot something important, something my husband understood even in his final days. Love written with truth does not belong to anyone else. It cannot be erased by silence or stolen by discomfort. It lives where it is needed most, waiting patiently until the moment it is called upon. And so I walk forward now, lighter than I was before, not because I carry less, but because I finally understand what truly belongs to me.